a man that I never thought I would one day introduce in any forum. But I thank God for today that I'm standing here to introduce Dr. Barrack Muluka, PhD, a seasoned publisher, publishing editor, a strategic and political communications and leadership communications consultant. He is also a writer in politics and regular commentator on social and political affairs on the global platform. He is a graduate of the University of Leicester with a PhD in politics and international relations, as well as a graduate of the University of Nairobi with master's qualifications in armed conflict and peace studies, PhD mass communications, and BA in linguistics and English. Barrack has undertaken key strategic communication consultancies under the aegis of the European Union, the UN, the World Bank, the Government of Kenya, the University of Nairobi, the Kenya Institute of Management, the Ford Foundation, and the National Democratic Institute, among many other challenging assignments. Barrack's career objective is to make outstanding contribution to a peaceful, fair, and just world through research and processing, packaging, and dissemination of appropriate information. With that said, let's put our hands together to welcome Dr. Barrack Muluka. Let's all be standing as singers. Let's round of applause, please. Round of applause.
Thank you very much for this fellowship, and I would like to recognize those who have invited me to join you here at the Don Bosco Utume Salesian Theological College for this 13th symposium, appropriately titled Pilgrims of Hope as the Exodus Mission of the Mother Church in Africa. I'd like to adopt the protocols that have been established here this morning to recognize the fathers of the church, the rest of the holy orders that are represented here this morning, and those who are still in training, to thank you very much for the opportunity. There's also my friend, colleague, and partner, Linda, who is with us. I think it's important to also recognize her. I'd like to thank my fellow speaker this morning, Elizabeth. I have listened with very keen attention and wondered whether I could live to the same levels of clarity of mind and thought and delivery. And congratulations, Elizabeth. As you spoke, of course, a lot of things went on through my mind, and as I believe they also went on through other people's minds. At some point I was wondering whether we get married to our cooks. We are married to housekeepers. We are married to the housemaid who's looking after the children. We are married to the sweepers. We are married to the bank account, the ATM machine. We are married to the security guard. What are we married to? But that's not my topic today. Also, at some point, was reminded as I listened to Elizabeth about the immediate contexts where we now have one gender marriages, and of the minister who was ministering in one such a marriage. And usually we normally get to that point where we say, I now declare you to be man and wife. And this person who was joining these two men together in matrimony wondered for a moment what he should say. And he went on to say, I declare you to be man united. So there you are. Allow me to look for the password. Elizabeth, I'm one of those ones who have many passwords. Sometimes I even forget which password I've used where. So you have to allow me to look for the password. And it is true, as you say, these things get us into trouble from time to time. I tell you, we who live in this space, it's not easy. It's easier said than done. Said and done, I was asked to talk about hope and socio-political, economic and cultural upheavals against hope. And I'd like to confess at the outset that I was the substitute speaker. The person who was invited and who was meant to be making this address this morning is a very close and dear friend and brother of mine. He's called Professor Lumumba, who, as you know, is the most eloquent person on the continent of Africa, and I think on the next continent and the next and the next one. So he's inimitable. He was not able to come, but Father Dunstan believed in me and he said, Barrack, you come and do it. So I'll do it as we do in football. The substitute is never I'll do it in that fashion as the substitute. But occasionally the substitute saves the day by scoring the most vital goal. So let's hope that this substitute could do that. I have refrained from coming with a PowerPoint presentation because as a speaker I'm a little selfish. I like all the attention and focus to be on me. And therefore, I don't want the PowerPoint to take away some of that focus and attention. I'll tell you that the topic that I was given, being a little challenging to me, I took the liberty to expand it a little bit and at the same time to narrow it a little bit. And so I have renamed it Socio-Political, Economic and Cultural Upheavals Against Hope in Africa in the 21st Century. And I've gone on to give it a subtitle, Can Africa Claim the Century? I've done that for two reasons. First, that I'm speaking to a Christian congregation, and in Christianity, baptism is the order of the day. And therefore, when you give me a topic, I can also baptize it and give it a bit of expansion of name. Secondly, I have done so because I think I wanted to give it a sharper context and sharper focus. A few years ago, maybe not so few now, because I realize as I get older, each time I speak of a few years ago, I discover that I'm speaking to audiences that consider the few years ago as a very long time ago. And there are generations today that are adults who do not remember that there was President Daniel Arap Moi. They cannot remember a single day in the life of President Daniel Arap Moi, because it's been just slightly less than a quarter century since President Moi left the scene. And so when you say a few years ago, people think that you must be as old as the mountains. And that I begin appreciating a lot more each time I go to the church. I see the father was a very young man today. When I go to the petrol station, I see that the petrol station attendants are just boys today. And when the policeman flags me down, I see that he was a very young man. But a few years ago, when Moi was still the president, the editors of the Newsweek magazine led with a cover story that was titled "The Hopeless Continent." The hopeless continent. And that hopeless continent was none other than the continent of Africa. And they covered the story in a manner that reminded me of the opening passages of Chinua Achebe's famous novel titled "No Longer at Ease." When you interact with "No Longer at Ease," you come across a young African civil servant who has recently returned to the continent from Europe, where he has been educated, is westernized without being pro-Western. And as he gets back home, his home is in Nigeria, he takes up a job in the public service. And he's given the opportunity to be the bursary officer in the Ministry of Education, and he's in charge of deciding who should be given scholarships to go and study, especially in Europe, where he has studied himself. The pressures, the tensions, the cares, and the wherefores of life lead him to run away from the principles that he has previously espoused, such as principles against corruption, the taking of bribes, and in the fullness of time, he takes bribes of all manner and denominations. And so, at some point, he is found out, he is arrested, and is taken to court. Achebe does not tell us what happens to this gentleman called Obi Okonkwo. He leaves it to us to fill in the blank spaces for ourselves. For the novel begins in a courtroom, and the rest of the narrative is a flashback into the past. And at the end, he again talks about the situation as it was in the opening chapter. And everyone is wondering why he did it. Senior man, well-educated in Europe, degree in English and classics, but who takes a bribe and who is taken to court for taking a bribe, for being corrupt. Everyone is asking that question. Why did he do it? But there is one person who is this gentleman's boss. He's called Mr. Green. And Mr. Green, in a members-only club, has been playing lawn tennis with his friend who works for the British Council. He's called the British Councilman. And the British Councilman, as they sit down, says to Mr. Green, I cannot understand why he did it. And Mr. Green asks who did what. When he says, Okonkwo, why he took the bribe. And Mr. Green says, I can understand. What I cannot understand is why people like you pretend not to understand. And so everyone in the club who is eavesdropping to that conversation cocks up their ears. They want to understand what Mr. Green understands, what people like the British councilman do not understand. And he says, the African is corrupt through and through. We have given him Western education, but what does it matter to him? He has been the victim of the worst climate in the world. And the environment he has lived in has sapped him of all intellect and all that's reasonable. And so he is corrupt through and through. In other words, we have this cusp in which the continent of Africa has been cast as a hopeless continent. And it cheers me up to see us meeting here, even now, in the 21st century, to reflect about hope. I'm also cheered up by the knowledge that the search for hope is not a uniquely African thing. The whole world is in need of hope and in search of hope, because hopelessness permeates the global community, especially in this day and age when the gifts of science and technology increasingly make the world that we live in a very unsafe place to be in. That it's the biggest contradiction of our times that in an age in which we are riding on the wheels of information and technology, on the wheels of our society and our generation, where we embed soldiers in wars, and we see wars as they happen. In the past, people used to wait for news from the war front. Read of King David waiting for someone to come from the war front to tell him what is happening there, and letters that he writes to be taken to the war front. If King David lived today, he would not need to write a letter. He would send a text message, WhatsApp message, and he would be watching the war as it happens. You saw that when they took out Osama bin Laden, Barrack Obama and his war council were sitting in the war room and they were watching as it was unfolding. But in this day and age of all these developments that God has enabled us, has favored us with the knowledge and the privilege to do, because when you see science advancing, please do not imagine for a moment that that is the work of the genius of the human being. It's just a little space that God is opening up for you to just share in what is happening. I saw somewhere where they say that Steve Jobs' last words were the words, "Oh my God, oh my God." That was the last thing that Steve Jobs of this thing that I have here said, and then he passed on. I've always imagined that he was seeing the other world as he was getting there, and he was wondering how marvelous it was. But in this particular age, we are suspended between hope and upheaval. especially we here on the continent of Africa. And for the next few minutes, you will permit me to share with you reflections on the paradox of Africa in the 21st century. I do so being informed by the World Bank report that came out at the turn of the millennium, and they did a publication which they said that the 21st century was going to be Africa's century to lose. They said we were the new frontier of hope for the entire global community, that we had a youthful population, that we had a lot of unexplored spaces, that we had natural wealth that was waiting to be tapped, that peace had come, there was a silencing of the guns, and we were the space for investment. So we were the new frontier of hope. Today, as we gather here, we are a quarter way through the century. That's how fast time flies. The first 25 years of the 21st century are almost gone. Just 2 more months from today to the day, and 25 years of the 21st century will be gone. Within that time and space, the continent is suspended between hope and upheaval. While African leaders and intellectuals have long attributed the continent's struggles to external manipulation, the argument is increasingly unsustainable. We have had decades of independence, and yet the continent is still in turmoil. When the World Bank and the IMF spoke of the 21st century as the century of hope, they recognized that we were coming out of spaces in which we had been enslaved, we had been taken to the Americas to work on the tobacco and the sugarcane plantations. We had worked on rubber plantations. We had been items of trade. We had left the continent kicking and screaming in chains. And after that, we had been colonized. And in our own spaces, slavery took a different guise. But in the 21st century, the century of liberty, we were supposed to be a new people. But lo and behold, while we were taken across the Atlantic in what has been called the Middle Passage trade, what has been called the transatlantic trade, while we were taken into those places, kicking and screaming, because we did not want to go Kunta Kinte. We did not want to go. They took us by force, kicking and screaming. Today, in the 21st century, we are dying in the shark-infested waters of the Mediterranean Sea, trying to get into those spaces. Isn't that a paradox, if we talk about paradoxes? And a lot of young people will tell you, I'd rather risk being smuggled from Africa on a boat to go through those waters of the Mediterranean and hopefully survive the sharks and survive the coast guards, because there's no hope in Africa. That we are seeing young people queuing outside foreign embassies, looking for visas to go to the lands of hope. That many of them will tell you, if I get to the United States of America, I will never come back. They leave Mother Africa with the express intent of never coming back. And even those who go intending to come back, in the majority of cases, they do not come back, because we have destroyed hope. Tanzania, which Father spoke of earlier on, has been cast over the past 6.5 decades as the haven of peace. Said Majid in 1866 gave their little village of Mzizima, I think that was what it was called, Father, Mzizima. It was a little fishing village on the East African coast between Mogadishu and Mozambique, or Maputo, what the Portuguese would call Lourenço Marques. And Said bin Sultan of Omani arrived at this coast in 1832 and established his new capital in Zanzibar and separated it from Muscat, where the Omanis lived. And in 1866, he visited Mzizima and he said, this place is so peaceful, I will make it part of my empire, and I will name this one Dar es Salaam, which in Arabic means a haven of peace. When we were in primary school in Jericho in Nairobi, we used to say heaven of peace. We couldn't tell the difference between heaven and heaven. But whatever the case, was the place to be, the haven of peace, the abode of peace, mahali pa amani. And President Samia Suluhu Hassan told us a few months ago to stay in our troubled spaces. She said that our spaces were indisciplined. She said that in our spaces we have been managed, and we should stay away from the only country that was remaining in the world as a peaceful space. As they say in Kiswahili, when you see someone's head being clean shaven like mine here, even when you have hair on your head, please begin making it wet. Otherwise, you will be shaved dry. And Madam Samia Suluhu Hassan is understanding the meaning of being shaved without water. She thought that the Gen Zs existed only in Kenya and in other mannerless places like Nigeria, and in places like Sri Lanka and Nepal and Madagascar. She didn't know that there were Gen Zs in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam. I know Dar es Salaam is, in a sense, emblematic of what you see in Tanzania. Tanzania had the privilege of being led by a philosopher king. Julius Nyerere was the quintessential philosopher king that Plato was talking about when he was reflecting on who should rule. And Plato said the best person to rule is a philosopher king, because the philosopher knows how societies should be ruled. That is number one. Number two, while philosophers know how societies should be ruled, they also don't love ruling. They want to stay away. And you have seen even biblically, the great people who know how societies should be managed are reluctant. They don't want to get into that spaces. They always tell God, why don't you send somebody else? They will not listen to me. Send somebody else. So even kings, as philosophers, don't want to occupy that space. And third, they also know when to leave. When the time to leave comes, they leave. When they sense that the society does not want them, they leave. They don't go cutting across the country saying two-term. They leave when they are philosophers. So, again, to recap, what we are about today is about a continent suspended between hope and upheaval. That we have heard African intellectuals long attributing our struggles to external manipulation. But the argument, as we say, is unsustainable decades after independence. And it is my take that the greatest challenges to Africa now lie within. There are challenges of corruption, challenges of mediocrity, that the more mediocre the individual is, the closer he or she is to power. That the challenges we have in Africa today pertain to generational stagnation. That is worth restating. Generational stagnation, erosion of public morality, and misrule. But amid this crisis, there persists an undercurrent of hope driven by cultural creativity, digital innovation, and of course, youth activism. And this youth activism will not go away because the youth cannot accept despair. The only alternative to the change that the young people hope for is despair as destiny. And the young people are not going to accept that. When we are young, we are told to go to school. We are told to learn, to read. We are promised great things. I don't know how this verse would go in English or Japanese or Korean. But if you are seated next to somebody who is Japanese or Korean, you can translate. I cannot resist the temptation to sing a little bit. Where I come from, we sing. I come from the Lake Basin, and no ceremony is complete without song. There's a little song that my voice, like that of old Major in Jojo Road's Animal Farm, is not very good, but you can listen to the song all the same. It says, tulikuwa vijana, tukicheza na masomo, kazi ya watoto, kweli kila siku ni kucheza. Someni vijana, muongeze pia bidii, mwisho wa kusoma mtapata kazi nzuri sana. That's what we were telling the the children, and that's what we are still telling them, even today. That don't play, read, work hard. At the end of school, you will get good jobs. Mambo ya siku hizi, sikupigana magumi, kalamu na karatasi, ndiyo silaha ya siku hizi. We were telling them, don't waste your time beating up your friend, your neighbors, your pen, your book. Those are the weapons of the day today. So, read, work hard. And we tell those who have not gone to school to tell the children to work hard. Waliokosa kusoma wafanye kazi kwa bidii. If you have not gone to school, work with your hands. Waliokosa kusoma wafanye kazi kwa bidii. Waambie watoto mwisho wa kusoma kweli furaha. Someni vijana, muongeze pia bidii. Mwisho wa kusoma mutapata kazi nzuri sana. And those jobs are not there. The only job that is there, if you are lucky, is to find a motorbike and become a motorbike rider. And for that, you don't need to go to university. And so the young people are even asking, why are you taking us to university? I can drive the bike, and I'll invent my own rules on the road. In these days you have these spaghetti motorcyclists. You don't even know where they're going to overtake you from. Left, right, center. That is the new Africa. And the situation on the roads, on our highways, represent the confusion and the hopelessness in the social order. If you want to know about the social order in any society, look at the public transport system. And the public transport system includes even the president and the presidential motorcade. When it comes, you stop. Because royalty is passing. And when royalty has passed, there is even more confusion because there are those who want to follow the royal motorcade. They are hooting and flashing at you. There are those Boda who are late. They are also now wiggling through the spaces. When you want to know about the social order, look at the trenches in the roads. Look at the craters in the roads. Look at the potholes. Listen to the hooting, the noise that everyone is making. When you stop at the traffic light because it is red, the fellow behind you is hooting. Impatience is the order of the day. And another one will pull on the side and get to you and throw a few expletives at you before driving on because you're such a daft character. How dare you stop because the light is red? When you want to know about the social order, look at the roads. In Europe, at least those few places that I've been to in Europe, they are not very many, but the few places I've been to in Europe, if you drive in a zigzag manner, you are either drunk or mad. You drive straight. In Africa, if you drive straight, you are either drunk or mad. because the roads do not allow you to drive straight. You're going to be driving into craters and into potholes and into goats. Because when the goat is coming, and the cow is coming, and the mkokoteni is coming, and there's a boda motorbike is coming, and the matatu is overtaking from this side, you cannot drive straight. You need to be demented to drive straight. So that is the condition in Africa. I've been asked to summarize in 15 minutes, and I intend to do it in 10. So, the summary begins. 1. Hope and upheaval in a new century. Africa entered the 21st century carrying the unfinished burdens of its past. It was emancipated and yet not sovereign. It was independent and yet insecure. The turn of the millennium was greeted with optimism. Africa rising. That was the clarion call. The African Renaissance and the promise of new democracies seemed to herald a break from the colonial shadow. But beneath the rhetoric of rebirth, the continent's socio-political fabric remains turbulent. Coups have returned. We know about Niger, we know about Mali, we know about Burkina Faso, and we know about many other places. The military, the boys in uniform are coming back. And the African Union is telling them, no, you cannot take power undemocratically. You must go to elections. And the elections themselves are being stolen. So you don't know how democratic the fellow who has arrived through a stolen election is, more than the fellow who has arrived in Burkina Faso using the barrel of the gun. At least the fellow in Burkina Faso is honest enough to say, I have taken power undemocratically. The one who steals the election says, I am democratically elected. It doesn't say, I have taken power undemocratically. So, there's corruption. Economies oscillate between booms and busts, and citizens live between survival and aspiration. 2. The offshore lane and the politics of evasion. Since independence, Africa's political class and scholarly elite have often located the source of the continent's struggles outside its borders. Colonialism, imperialism, neocolonialism, all these are blamed for economic dependency and political fragility. The indictment has substance, indeed with some level of validity. Africa was partitioned and plundered, its economies were re-engineered for extraction, its identities fractured. Yet, 6 decades after independence, the perpetual externalization of blame has become an evasion of responsibility. The post-colonial state cannot forever live on what I call borrowed excuses. 3. Shifting shape of global power. The offshore lane is no longer confined to the West. China, India, Turkey, Russia, and the Gulf states now compete for Africa's resources and loyalties. New formations of domination are circular. Digital colonialism has also arrived. Here, global tech giants harvest African data. Climate conditionalities are also here, where the poorest bear the cost of a warming planet. And debt diplomacy, where loans buy influence. Here, 3 years ago, we were saying we had reached the age of the end of borrowing. We promised that we only needed 2 years and there would be no more borrowing from anyone. 3 years later, we are up to here in debt. 3 years ago, we were here. Now we are here. 2027, we will be here in debt. So while exploitation persists, the terms of engagement have changed. Africa now has leverage, however. Youthful energy, mineral wealth, and cultural capital. Unfortunately, we rarely convert them into bargaining power. 4. Internal villains, corruption, patronage, and the failure of agency. If colonialism distorted Africa's beginnings, corruption has poisoned its continuities. Across the continent, the state has become a vehicle for personal enrichment. Individuals who could not even wear a decent pair of shoes before they got into office, they now own choppers. How now? Where does that happen? Institutions exist in name, not in function. Public service has degenerated into self-service. This moral collapse has fostered mediocrity, where leadership is measured not by performance, but by patronage and the art of survival. The post-colonial elite have turned sovereignty into private property. And here in Kenya, we have recently enacted the Privatization Act, which is paving way for more of that. In the process, we are producing dependency, not on foreign masters, but on domestic oligarchs. 5. There are only 7, so I'm winding down. Economic contradictions, growth without transformation. The early 2000s brought talk of Africa rising, fueled by commodity booms and foreign investment. Yet the growth proved shallow. A rise in numbers, not in structures. Most of these numbers are cooked. When you listen to these numbers and you compare and contrast them with the lived experience, you get the picture of a country that is becoming increasingly richer without the citizens themselves getting any richer. And that is another paradox. The paradox of riches without rich people. When global prices fall, so does prosperity. Debt has returned with vengeance, diversified among China, Eurobond holders, and multilateral agencies. Youth unemployment is endemic, and informal economies, like borders, sustain the majority. Yet amidst this stagnation lies potential, if only leadership could match ambition with execution. When you say tutajenga barabara toka pale tukuje turemuke pale toka hapo itakuja hapa toka hapo itakuja toka as if you are doing football commentaries. If those ambitions could be matched with execution, change would become us. 6. Cultural upheavals reclaiming the African gods. If politics disappoints and economies stumble, Africa's culture thrives. The continent's creative and intellectual reawakening is one of its most striking features of the 21st century. From Afrobeats and Nollywood to Pan-African fashion and literature, Africa now projects influence across the world. The decolonial term in academia, the call to epistemic freedom, seeks to liberate Africa, African thought from Eurocentric friends. The cultural insurgency is more than aesthetic. It's psychological decolonization, a reclaiming of the African imagination. We have to reimagine Africa. We have to reimagine an Africa without the non-tariff barriers. An Africa where you can leave Cape Town and come to Harare by road, and from there find your way to Lusaka, through Dar es Salaam, to Nairobi, all the way to Kampala, to Yaoundé, and on to Rabat in Morocco. When I was in primary school, we used to hear something they called the Great North Road. I have not seen it. So many years later. Yet we must go there. We must have a continent that is interconnected with the railroads, that we wake up in the morning in Mombasa and we go to Kampala by rail. We get to Kampala within 3.5 hours or 2 hours. We do our work in Kampala and we come back to Mombasa. We have got to reimagine, but also to follow up with action. Generational reckoning. Perhaps the sharpest fault line in Africa today is generational. And I'm happy to see those young people there. The ruling class in Africa is aging and self-serving. The populace is young and impatient. With a median age under 20, Africa is governed by men old enough to be grandfathers of the governed. The youth. Yes, it is true that Africa is governed by men old enough to be the grandfathers of the governed. Some of whom should be governing. The youth born after independence have no emotional attachment to liberation myths. They are digital natives in analog states. They are connected to global realities and intolerant of excuses. That's why they are shaving Mama Suluhu without water. Their protests, hashtag #EndSARS, hashtag fees must fall, hashtag #EndAmer, articulate impatience with hypocrisy and demand competence over charisma. This is not a rebellion, Mama Samia Suluhu Hassan. This is not a rebellion. This is moral renewal. Next, from victimhood to vision, hope in Africa has never been a matter of statistics. It is an act of defiance. In slums, villages, and tech labs, ordinary Africans sustain life where leadership has failed. Civil society, religious networks, and informal economies embody a resilience that defies despair. Yet endurance alone is not enough. The continent must convert survival into transformation, from grievance to governance, from blame to blueprint. To claim the 21st century, Africa must rebuild institutions, cultivate integrity, and educate for creativity, not for conformity. So, finally, can Africa claim a century? The 21st century will not be granted. nobody will give it to you. It must be claimed through vision, discipline, and courage. The world owes Africa justice, but Africa owes itself responsibility. If the continent can transform its turmoil into creative energy, if it can turn its pain into policy, and its youth into builders rather than migrants, then African century will not be a slogan, it will be a fact. But if it continues to romanticize the past, recycle mediocrity, and glorify grievance, then history will move forward without Africa. Thank you very much.
Wow. Where our hearts were burning when you were speaking with us. I can't add anything else, but we request you to prepare your hands so that we can give Dr. Muluka 5 factorial claps. So if you start with 1 up to 5, so those who struggle with the equation like myself, you're allowed to copy your neighbor. Now we start 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we'll proceed to the panel discussions.